I think that was the shortest of the videos I've seen at any of these. I thought it hadn't started yet and suddenly it was over. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here in Canberra, on the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. I honour their continued contribution to country, culture and community, and pay my respects to elders, past and present, as well as to Indigenous people who are with us today. Today we're talking about a topic dear to the hearts of both universities and policymakers, which is jobs and skills and the role of universities in meeting Australia's jobs and skills need. And I'm joined by a really expert and eminent panel today who I'll introduce briefly and then give each of them an opportunity to engage in what I hope you'll all find a very interesting dialogue. I'm Renee Leon, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Charles Sturt University. I'll probably take this moment for a short advertorial in which I just mention that Charles Sturt is #1 for graduates who get jobs, and so I hope we can make a contribution to the jobs and skills of Australia going forward. Joining me on the panel is Tim Reid, who is the President of the Business Council of Australia, but also still a very active business person, co-managing director of Potentia Capital, an Australian private equity firm that invests in and grows local software businesses. And all of you may well know his previous product, which is that he was 12 years the CEO of MYOB, a very important online accounting and payroll provider for Australia's small SMEs. Tim has got a long career in Asia, Europe and the USA, and going back to his education, it goes back to Harvard Business School, where he received a Master of Business Administration, and then he is Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Melbourne. So welcome, Tim. Jenny Dodd is the Chief Executive of TAFE Directors Australia and leads TAFE positioning with the Commonwealth Government, which is not only the TAFEs themselves, but also the dual sector university providers. Jenny's had a long career in vocational education and training. She was the CEO of TAFE in Tasmania, the CEO of Gold Coast TAFE in Queensland, and the Deputy CEO for the Canberra Institute of Technology. She also holds qualifications in education, human resource management and commerce. And last but far from least, my colleague Attila Brungs, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of New South Wales since January 2022, and prior to UNSW, Attila was the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Technology, Sydney, a very successful period from 2014 to 2021. Attila has held senior positions with CSIRO and with McKinsey and Company, and he's a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford University with a doctorate in inorganic chemistry and a university medal in industrial chemistry from the University of New South Wales, where he is now, I'm sure, very proudly Vice-Chancellor. So as you can see, we have a great panel that brings together universities, the vet sector, and industry, and I hope we'll have a really productive discussion about how each of these as partners can help solve jobs and skills for Australia, both now and into the future. So I might start then with just asking each of you to spend just a few minutes on a single question, which is, you know, Australia's currently facing this immediate skills shortage and also the prospect that over time that mismatch between the skills we've got and the skills we need will continue to grow as the nature of work changes. So if I can start with each of you to say from your own sector, what does the university or the vet sector or industry have to contribute to solving this problem? Attila, can I ask you to start first? How can universities contribute to that?
So I suppose the first thing I'd say is, pretty much because you're asking all of us, I think that the way of the future is, there are 4 pillars of how do we shape the skills and capacity of Australia to meet the needs of the future. In the post-secondary world, universities have a very important role, the vet has an absolutely critical role, business has a very critical role, and private providers have a very critical role. And the important thing is, as we go and develop our own roles, these roles need to be intermeshed and complementary. because each of us bring different parts to the puzzle. And if any one of us, if I'm worried about, and I'm not too worried because I think they're all doing well, but if any one of us fail, Australia as a whole will be less well off. So I think all of us, each of those 4 pillars, has to move and move differently. Now I can talk a bit about the universities, for example, and I know the universities right across the sector have been working very hard on what is our model, how do we respond to the changing nature of skills. And if you think about it, since 1989 to 2019, there has been a decline in what you call routine cognitive skills. There's sort of 4 skills that the RBA looks at, manual or cognitive, and routine and non-routine. And in the past, cognitive were on the way up, manual was on the way down as the economy shifted. But recently, there's been a massive shift, and the one that's changed the most is what you call routine cognitive, okay? And many parts of our professions, with respect, are routine cognitive. Where universities have an important role to play is what we call the non-routine cognitive. And that's what we have to make sure that we build in. So all of us, I know, and you know just at your university, are grappling with how do we make sure that what we call our traditional offerings, our traditional undergraduate and postgraduate, is not only does it develop the key skills, and I'll talk about that later on, to be relevant in the workplace now, but also make sure that our graduates are fundamentally versed in some of the critical, what I call foundational, systems thinking, creativity, analytics, the ability to look at problems and work with other humans in doing those problems. So if we think through the nature of automation, that is really challenging, and I mean, probably Tim could talk about it more than I, the amount of jobs that are disappearing but being recreated. Our role as a university is not just the skills part, working with the other 4 players, but also really making sure that the fundamentals around those creativity, human-human interactions are there to future-proof our graduates for the years to come.
Thanks, Attila. And what about in the vet sector, Jenny? Is it the same kind of contribution, or how do you contribute to making sure Australia can meet the jobs and skills now and into the future?
So thank you very much, and thank you to Attila, because I think it's not that dissimilar, but it has some nuances that are different. One of the things I think going forward, and Attila identified the various players, I would say that those various players not only have the role they have to play, but their level of interaction has to step up a significant notch. And if we think, I was in the session just before lunch, which was the Boeing session with the CRC, and I thought it was really interesting in those sessions, those who were there as well, the reminder that those sorts of complex relationships between employers, university, TAFE, the community, and students in local context and in local economies, and I want to make more of that as we go on through this hour, are really, really critical and really, really hard. They don't happen simply, and I think the man from Boeing who spoke said really astutely the importance of project management in how we deliver those interactions going forward. So in terms of VET encompasses all of those attributes of university, but we also start at that foundation skills level, that is the foundation skills for many of our students in VET, and I think the universities are feeling this as well from some of my conversations over the last few days, with limited literacy and perhaps from what we might have experienced 20 years ago, significant literacy, numeracy and digital literacy problems coming into some of those courses that are so critical for our economy. A good example is the Certificate 3 that churns, Apprentice Certificate 3 in electrotechnology that churns out our electricians. We in TAFE, and we do about 70% of the training in that, absolutely vital qualification. The people entering that now have not necessarily got the mathematical skills that you need for success. So there's a lot more going on in terms of the support that we need to be providing to equip people for lifelong learning or for just getting through the first initial courses. But I do think it's the interaction between all those players that's so critical.
And Tim, you know, we've heard from people who are providing most of the training. What role does industry have to play, either in identifying the needs or in contributing to the training itself?
So I think industry plays a critical role, and you know, as Jenny and Attila have outlined, it is the bringing together of each of these parties, which is part of the secret sauce that we need to be continuing to invest in and frankly pushing ourselves, each of us, to do more. But if you think about business and industry, there's probably two real components that we contribute to. Generally speaking, when people enter enter a business, they have some sort of foundational skills that have come through their primary, their secondary, whether it's then a vet or a university degree. What we know is that need for continued upskilling and reskilling is greater now than it has been at any point in time, and that is only going to increase. And that's sort of the first responsibility where business comes in. One of those I think business does very well and is quite natural at, and one it's very poor, and frankly the incentives are that it's likely to remain that way. So when it comes to upskilling, and that is sort of the natural evolution in a job where tasks will change, and the alpha beta research would say that it is something like 20% of the tasks that make up any job will evolve over a decade. Business is pretty good at that. It's on the job, it's often short courses, it's discrete pieces of learning on a continuous basis. When it comes to reskilling, which might be someone having a change of career, and the statistics would say that will happen 2 or 3 times throughout a working life at this point in time, then that becomes very challenging for businesses. Because in general, that reskilling will mean that the individual will attract those skills, but in all likelihood take them to a new employer. And so I think the sort of the natural incentives and mechanisms that are in place that work really well for upskilling don't provide for industry to play a particularly large part in the funding of or the contribution to that reskilling for the individual. Certainly we can engage with others in the sector to say, how can courses be more relevant to the skills that are needed, etc. But I do think there is a real challenge there in reskilling. The second thing that I'd say, and I think this goes to where Jenny was going, it is a real challenge for businesses as an increasing part of the community don't have basic skills in numeracy, literacy, digital skills, etc. And the role that business plays at that point in time is to try and not exclude people from careers because of that fact. And again, that becomes very challenging for individual businesses, but it is a reality of the community that we're all a part of, and so industry has to be a part of seeking and driving solutions.
Attila mentioned how we need to skill our students for fundamental skills like creativity and human-to-human interaction and problem-solving and systems thinking, and yet we often hear from industry sort of a demand for very specific skills we need now. And I think government historically has tended to respond to that and say more concrete skills, more actual employable skills that we can deploy straight away. How do we keep incentives in the system, including in the demand by industry, for the kinds of lifelong skills that Attila's talking about?
Yeah, it's really interesting. About 3 or 4 years ago at the BCA, we went out and look, our membership are the biggest businesses in Australia, so it's very skewed when most employment happens in small and medium businesses. So I don't want to purport for a moment that necessarily what we found is representative of the entire community, but I think in this instance it's probably instructive. And we had deep conversations with the head of people and the CEOs across all of our members, and those were the exact skills that came back that they value most. When they're bringing in graduates, it was the ability to be adaptive, resilience, the ability to problem solve. They were what I would call underlying capabilities. And if I think of my time running MYOB, we could go and hire someone who was taught to program in a certain language, and there was a good chance by the time we recruited them and then by the time they started that the specific skill that they needed had evolved. But the ability to be able to, what I would call in that profession, apply analytical and scientific-based thinking was always going to be present. And so they could learn to code in a new language fairly quickly if they had the right frames and frameworks in place. And so I think there's complete consistency from what we hear when we talk to our members.
So, of course, we can all talk about what industry needs and wants, but then there's the whole population of school leavers who decide to enrol in something they're interested in. how do we get those things to line up? Attila, have you got any thoughts on how we align getting students to enrol in things? And Jenny, you might have thoughts about this as well. How we get students to enrol in the things that are going to meet future skill needs, or do we just, they enrol in what they love and we hope that they're adaptable enough to translate it to the jobs of the future?
In some ways, it's a combination of both. And getting back to what Tim was saying, you know, you've got those foundational skills we talked about, the creativity. But again, universities, it's very important, as does TAFE, teaches the, let's call it very practical skills on top. You know, I want to have a creative engineer, but I also love an engineer that designs a safe bridge that I drive over. Okay, so I don't want to just have a creative bridge. And that's really important too. And then for those engineers, they need to know that their skills are going to adapt all the way through their lives. And again, back to what Tim was saying about this upskilling, reskilling is absolutely critical as we go through. So part of what we need to do is, it's not just about attracting them to different courses, it's about giving them the opportunities to see where their career can evolve. And I think that's something that's fundamentally different now than when I was an undergraduate. I mean, I've had students who come up to me when I've spoken, as I've gone around the faculties at UNSW, talked about, and they've asked me about my career and what I've done, and literally some of them say, wow, you've had a boring career. You've literally had 2 jobs. You know, when I'm as old as you, I would have 40 jobs. Okay, and that's the excitement of our students today.
The exuberance of youth.
So and that's what we need to do as we design, not just, so the university is grappling with 2 things. One is, how to make sure what let's call it traditional offerings, undergraduate, more traditional postgraduates, have those skills we spoke about before, but also enable people to learn and then grow in their careers, and the careers shape out. But the second part that universities are doing more and more is we're actually engaging in, complementary of course with VET, business and private providers, lifetime learning. And that is absolutely critical, okay? Say, for example, at UNSW, we've got a program that we've done across probably 5,000 of our alumni in turning how to lead, okay? And this is just the start. So we talk almost like an evergreen degree of how do you support students, not just students, how do you support people all the way through their careers? And I think that's something very different about university and their relationship with alumni. In the past, you know, alumni have been important parts of the community, but often, with respect, you know, only contacted when they're rich, okay, and they can get money back at university. What we do now is, how do we think through, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 careers and support them all the way through, and not just by ourselves, but in partnership with business. How do we go to the University of New South Wales? We've got some of the biggest, most exciting things we're doing now at the moment is in partnership with big business across Australia, as not just a, what you were calling upskill, but actually big shifts of reskilling. Because at Tim, I know many of your compatriots at the moment, you can't even find the people you need, okay? So you need to actually reskill them as well. So I think it's in partnership also. We've got some wonderful partnerships with TAFE across the Greater Sydney on how do we, what I call this evergreen learning all the way through their lives. The challenge that I'd actually have as we think through that is I see a world where we've got to think through, particularly for Australia, how do we enable people to do this lifetime learning, okay? So it's not just about attracting them in with a set of skills that the economy needs in the future. I think anybody can sit down and say the economy will need these 6 skills in 2.5 years is dreaming, okay? We've got general directions that we can work for. But what we do have, particularly, we've got an economy that has many small enterprises. How do we create a system for lifetime learning that will enable people in those businesses, not just in many of the big businesses in the BCA, to continue to be developed, redeveloped, skilled, upskilled. And that's a lot more challenging, okay?
Because Tim, I imagine your members, as you say, probably do invest in upskilling. You know, they've got a whole HR department and they've got a training wing and they're prepared to send people on courses. But when the majority of businesses in Australia might have 10 employees or less, they probably can't afford for 2 of them to go off to a course, and they probably don't want to pay for that either. So how do we end up with not having just the favoured few get reskilled? Is that something TAFE plays a role in, or universities play a role in, or business is going to do, so we don't end up with only the lucky few get upskilled and the rest just fall further and further behind?
You go, Tim.
So I think we're talking about system change here, right? And Attila said some things as very articulately, but are really worth pausing on. We're not talking about learning being a product anymore. We're talking about it being an evergreen service. And in software, we would say we've moved from a desktop perpetual license to a subscription that's always on and being provided every day. You know, it's not buying a CD, it's subscribing to Spotify. And that's where we need to think about learning. Now, if we're going to do that across the system, we've got great examples in Australia of where we've come up with some really creative ways as a community of providing those sorts of opportunities. You know, I would look at superannuation as a very local solution to a problem that is faced all around the world, but that frankly some forethought has meant that we're in a much better position than almost every other country around the world. I think we should be challenging ideas about things like HECS only being available at a moment in time for a specific purpose, and saying, why isn't that a lifelong account? You know, why can't we put tax-free dollars into a lifelong learning fund, which you draw down on and probably start in a negative balance when you're 21 or 22, you sort of pay back, but you can draw down and up and down on it right throughout your lifetime. The idea of long service leave is something that is fairly antiquated in a world where people move jobs all the time, because if you're not with the same employer for 9 or 10 years, you don't get it. Well, why don't we have employers that contribute those sorts of funds into learning leave rather than long service leave? And it's going to have to be done at the macro level. So, you know, it can't be just dependent on the fact that you're with one employer for a long period of time before you get learning leave. The employer actually pays it in, just like they accrue long service leave on their balance sheet, such that it can be transferable with an individual across employers. Like, we've got to think at a system level, because that 10-person business is not going to be able to. That business owner is worried about making payroll, they're worried about whether someone's going to turn up or be sick tomorrow, they're worried about all of the day-to-day elements of running a small business, which are hard and all-consuming. So I think the answer has to be a more systemic system level.
There's some ideas for the accord there, Tim. Jenny, coming back to you, so, you know, you've probably had the most interface with industry in the TAFE, about very up close with them about what skills they're looking for and what the vet sector can do to meet them. What's your learnings from that? How good are we at making sure that the educational systems we provide actually meet the skill needs of the industry they're going into?
I'm going to come back to the first part of your question, which was around student demand, because it's actually not just about the students, it's not just about the educational experience, it's actually about the work design of the industries. And when we look at where the biggest growth in employment is, it's in the health and aged care and the care industries. And yet, if anyone was listening to the drum 2 Friday nights ago, it was said very clearly, why would anyone work there? Because the actual design of the work in those industries is such that they need to do some real thinking about how do you attract people to them. So student demand is actually linked beyond just what we do in our tertiary education sectors. It's actually about what the industries are looking for as well. I think one of the things that Attila said, which was really important about vocational education and training, is where we need to be going now, which is away from what has been a very narrow job-focused approach to much better ability to equip our students to have transferable skills. And that then is that lifelong learning ability to draw from learning, to be able to move around into where you're going. But when you talk about skilling for industry, and VET is really good at it, and we've been doing it forever, the learn and earn approach cannot be underestimated as such a valuable approach to where a student will get the most experience to be able to exit them with the understanding of the expectations and the capabilities, and I'm going to use capabilities in a broader sense than skills or just knowledge, the capabilities that are expected by those employers in those environments. And we're seeing that model expanded much more broadly, and we're well aware of some of the changes that are happening in the university sector as well. But I think even on that drum program, it is beholden on employers to make those learn and earn experiences brilliant. And that's not just about money. It's actually about designing the earning part of the learning time with great learning, not utilising students in ways that are inappropriate for the course they're doing. And that is a consistent challenge that we've confronted in the TAFE sector, where we do enormous amounts of apprenticeship-based learning, is making sure that the students are actually getting the experience that they're required to get in the workplace. And I'm going to quote my colleague Sandy Chong here, who heads up the hairdressing group, saying it is beholden on employers to provide that right experience for those students so that they are really valuing that time that they have in industry. And so it's the combination of where you learn, how you learn, and that workplace, that real workplace experience that makes a difference, I think, in terms of the exit point.
And so there's a real capability issue about how we work with employers to make sure that happens, isn't there? Otherwise, your hairdressing example, they just use the apprentice to sweep the floor all day and they never actually learn some technical skills.
That's correct.
And yet, to what extent is the educational institution really governing and ensuring that students have a great workplace learning experience? I know universities go through the same piece. We send a lot of our students off to work integrated learning, but then they're in the hands of the education department or the health department or the engineering firm, where we don't control how good that experience is. So it is one of these instances where we need a better join-up between the provider and the industry.
Certainly, I think we need employers to be making that investment in mentoring. Because even though, for example, in our sector, a first-year apprentice is a very expensive commodity, to be honest. It costs them a lot of money to take a first-year apprentice. But it costs them a lot more money if they don't hold them through to second and third and fourth year. And most apprentices leave an apprenticeship in the first year. So if they don't hold them through, they've actually wasted all that money. So there is that combination. And certainly, and I think Tim said it, you know, the vast majority of our businesses in Australia are small business. So how do we help them to be able to mentor appropriately? And it isn't a little challenge, it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
And it's one that I think we're pretty good at doing in TAFE because we've had, you know, decades of that sort of model.
We've been dependent, really, on skilled migration for increasingly and for a long time to fill critical skill shortages, both in the vocational products and in the university products. Is there any pathway that industry can see for us to break that dependence? You know, one of the suggestions that was made in a session earlier in the conference is that, you know, every time industry takes a skilled migrant, they should be compelled to invest that much in a degree for a person who in 4 years' time will have that skill. So it's a bit of a blunt instrument. But what other instruments are there for making sure that we can break this very significant dependence on skilled migration and actually do more to train our own?
Yeah, so I did just turn my page here to make sure I get these numbers right, Renee. But for a temporary skilled visa, every business has to contribute to the Skilling Australians Fund. It's $7,200 that gets contributed for every visa that is issued. So that's already in place, and you know, business pays quite a heavy cost. Where that money goes, I can't tell you, but it's not that business isn't contributing to the public purse every time a skilled visa is awarded. Look, I think there's two questions there. I don't think this is an either or. And in fact, I think the Minister yesterday made some very insightful remarks on this, that skilled immigration is one of the genuine economic levers that Australia has to continue to drive economic growth. And we should be thinking about it very strategically and thinking about how we use that as a lever that benefits all Australians. And so I don't think that means that we shouldn't be investing in skills here. But I think skilled migration is a very important part of how we continue to be a prosperous nation. Look, my overall comment here, I think, is that we should be trying to encourage businesses to invest more. And we could easily do that by having an interplay between the migration system and the skills system. So, you know, we've talked with government about what we call a trusted trainer model, which is that skilled visas are only available to businesses that pay and contribute a certain amount of payroll to the skills of their team members. But if they do cross that threshold, then it's a very accelerated process for them to be able to get skilled worker visas. I think that brings about the right alignment. What you wouldn't want to do is have Australian businesses go offshore because they can't get the skills here. And that happens all the time. And look, I shouldn't say you wouldn't want that to happen. Of course you want it to happen, but you want it to happen on top of, doing as much as they can to create great high-paying jobs locally. So I think it's about an interplay and getting the systems right so that we optimise across all of those channels rather than saying one is good and one is bad.
Coming back to lifelong learning, Attila, which I know you're really passionate about, both at your last university and at UNSW, one of the things that I know you worry about with lifelong learning is that the people who are your alumni, and probably the people who are Tim's employees, Tim's business's employees, they're all reasonably well equipped to do some lifelong learning. They both have the knowledge that they need to. They've probably got employment arrangements where they can get some time off or money where they can afford to enrol in a short course at UNSW. But there'd be vast swathes of the economy where people aren't going to have the skills to get lifelong learning, to even know how to get it. And going to your point, Jenny, about the industries that they work in, they're already working really long hours in an exhausting industry like aged care that's not giving them any time off to upskill. How do we avoid a future where we've got the reskilling haves and the reskilling have-nots, which not only bad for those individuals, but will just drag down whole sectors of our economy?
Not an easy solution. I will go to something Tim said before and also draw from. The first of all is, in the past, and you and I have spoken about this, Renee, lifetime learning has been almost not a nice to have, but something where people took to accelerate, progress their career, change careers. Okay, I see a world where, and we're discussing today, it is, as you said, an absolute necessity. Okay, it is just how the world will be. If that is the case, okay, then as you described, something I worry very much about is that there will split. There'll be a binary divide again between the haves and the have-nots. That, for me, is also then starts to become something like market failure, okay? And such that even now we have a government who provides and thinks of a system by which we make sure that with the HEC system, it was designed so that the initial burden of a university education or a TAFE education did not prevent you from taking one up, okay? We now have to think through what is the way that we can create a system, and maybe it's something Tim called this lifetime learning account that people can dip in and out of. But it's not just for the fees for their experience. It's also for, we need to think through how do they support themselves. Okay, it's all too easy to say, okay, why don't we just extend it to HECS to lifetime learning for fees? But then if you said before, you're working in the healthcare sector, you're working 12 hours a day, I don't have time to do it. How can I fund taking that time off? So that's one answer. I do think it will come back to you, and the Accord is an interesting part of it. How do we think about what a system looks now? Much like back in the 80s, we thought of a system for Australian higher education or for Australian universities that tried to mitigate against inequity in the system through the HEC system. We know lifetime learning is going this way. What do we need to do design now? And I think the Accord is a really important part to set up our system in the future so we don't get this binary divide. The second part of the answer, I do think actually sits a little bit with maybe some of the policy settings of what business is doing, particularly across the small, medium enterprises. What are the incentives governments can put in place, whether through tax regimes or other regimes, to support this development journey that they're on? One of the challenges we have in Australia is that there is a massive growth in the need for skilling, upskilling, reskilling, and many, of course, of Tim's members have recognised this and are making those investments. But not all businesses can afford to do it, particularly many of the small businesses. So do we have the policy settings right at the moment to support the vast quantities of SMEs so that people can take time to do TAFE qualification to get those broader skills that you were talking about to enable them to move between jobs? That's another question I think we need to do. So for me, these are a lot of policy discussions we need to have now so we can set the system up for the next 30 years to mitigate, ameliorate against any inequities.
Now, a whole lot of questions are coming in which are not on that screen, but they are on the app, fortunately. And a number of them are going to the question I wanted to ask each of you before I actually go to questions, which is about the how we work together piece. And so, many of the things that we've all said today and which we started off with people's initial remarks was about no one party on this platform or in the economy can solve this alone. Can I ask each of you, and I might start with you, Jenny, to talk about what's one specific thing we could do that would increase the necessary integration between sectors that's going to enable that joined-up approach going forward?
I'm going to answer two questions, Renee, because I wanted to have a little bit of a say into the equity one as well. I actually think the focus in the Accord around equity is absolutely fundamental. And we do run a risk as a society of the haves and have-nots in knowledge and skills. And therefore, at Jobs and Skills Australia at the summit, I was fortunate enough to be there representing the TAFE sector. There was a big conversation around equity, around being able to provide access to those groups who haven't had those opportunities. And certainly the Free TAFE that rolled out for us for the first year is all about access groups and helping those groups. That doesn't come easily. You have to actually also provide the support structures for people who don't have the social capital of learning to be able to succeed. And we saw that for the first time this year in that there was additional funding for support, pastoral care support and also learning support, which was fantastic. But I think it is something that Mary O'Kane has on her agenda, and it's a big ticket item, and I think it leads into my answer for the next part of this question. The TAFE sector, or the vet sector more broadly, is a place often for those who get the first bite of learning. We have over 50% of our students are over 30 years of age, and people don't always realise that, and for many it's their first bite into learning of a structure. They're not the post-school generation. They've come into learning, as this is in the TAFE sector, as older people, and they're often women. Once you get to that sort of age group, if you look at all the TAFE statistics, it's 50-50 all the way through, but if you start to cut out the male apprentices, by the time we get to age groups of 27, 28 years of age, there's a lot of women and they haven't been in learning before. And so I think it's a real opportunity for us to have a look at how our various systems work and use the right place for the right people to equip them with the skills for lifelong learning. And TAFE certainly has a role there. And over half our members are also higher education providers. And so it's in that small learning environment. But here is what's really critical is, from our point of view, we need an integrated tertiary education sector. I will unashamedly say, and I know there are colleagues here, VCs here, who know this to be a fact, that the TAFE sector more broadly is grossly underfunded. We have to be able to look at where we are going to equip those equities. In this year, we have the Accord happening. We also, in our sector, have what's called the National Skills Partnership, which is how money moves from the Commonwealth to the states for the vocational education and training sector. Both of those very big pieces of work have to have a principle that says vet and higher education have to work together. And when you have a principle, you can't just have the principle without funding that. So we have to incentivise that to make it happen. Because I've been around this place for a long time, played in many really great projects, but they've never been sustainable between our sectors, and it's time. Lifelong learning will see people dip in and out of those two sectors. They'll take a bite of this, a bite of that, once they've got the base qualifications. And we've got to have a look at our structures that enable that to occur.
Thanks, Jenny. Attila, what's your one big idea for how all the sectors that need to can work together to meet the jobs and skills challenge? Do you agree with Jenny about the unified tertiary sector?
I think that certainly would help. But I mean, for me, there's no one big idea, unfortunately. If there was a silver bullet, we would have done it before in the past. But I am very buoyed and optimistic by just the significantly increased collaboration and connectedness between those four pillars that I described, okay? Universities now work much closer with business than we ever have before, okay? It's not just in terms of the lifetime learning, work integrated learning. At UNSW, UTS, many of the universities here, we have people from business come in and teach courses all the way through. We have, I think, 80% of our students want to have work integrated placements during their times here. Similarly, we have great partnerships with TAFE. So I think, and private providers as well. So we know that we can't do everything. I think in the past, it has been more silent because we thought, we'll stick to our knitting, TAFE sticks to its knitting, business sort of takes people in and then sticks to its knitting, and private providers pick up where they can find the places that are most needed. And there's, I suppose, a gap in the market, shall we say. I think the world has fundamentally shifted. So there's no one big idea, but the idea that we continue to work with each other, that we recognise a common challenge that we all have, and that I think it's important that we all now recognise we cannot solve it alone. And only by working with business, with TAFE, with the private providers, will Australia become stronger.
And as the current top-rated question says, of course, the Accord process creates a unique opportunity, not just to all make that sort of generic commitment to working together, but to actually address how the regulatory and funding frameworks might enable there to be fewer barriers to working together. So,
but even structural things like, for example, we're talking about, and this is a very simple idea. In the previous session, we heard how we had Service New South Wales came up with a wonderful electronic driver's license, and their electronic wonder. Now, think about qualifications. Universities Australia has been working for years on a qualifications wallet for degrees. That's nuts, okay? Why do we have a wallet that has degrees? It has TAFE qualifications, it has business badges, it has private provider ones. All of those are shareable, okay? And then people can actually start giving what we call RPL for the different pieces moving around. And then suddenly we get an integrated system that actually allows people to move. So I think there's a number of both regulatory but also foundational infrastructure pieces that can actually make this easier.
Tim, what do you think we need to do more for the parts of the system to work together better? And then I've got about a quarter of an hour for questions, so keep them coming, but I've got a few to get through. So
let me pick up on a couple of themes that Attila and Jenny have spoken about, but create a bit of context to my answer first. I think in Australia we can often talk ourselves down and sort of get lost in the trees and fail to zoom out and have a look at the forest. Over the last 30 years, we've moved GDP per capita from number 22 in the world to number 9 in the world. If you look at education in Australia, we punch way above our weight on global standards for the quality of educational institutions that we have. There is, to Attila's point, far more collaboration happening between industry and between both the higher education and the vet sector than I think there has been, at any point in time. Of course, there is more we can do, but there are some good things happening. The part that I worry most about goes back to Jenny's point on equity, that this system is working for a good chunk of people, but there are a group those that are excluded from it, the gap is becoming greater and it's becoming far more difficult to bridge. So if we could do one thing, I would really like to see, if you look at the unemployed, 20% of unemployed people are long-term unemployed. There are a chunk of, and that means more than 12 months. When you go through and look at people with disabilities and their exclusion from the workplace, and frankly their exclusion from the ability to develop the skills to get into the workplace. So I would like us to put more focus on working together on solving some of those specific challenges, and have a bit of confidence that actually in the mainstream there are good things that are happening, but really make sure that there aren't too many people excluded from what I'll call that general draft that picks up the majority.
So I might turn to some of the emerging audience questions. One is, it's a perennial and thorny problem that you might have a go at first, Tim, which is how predictable are industry needs? Is it, as Attila said, just a fool's errand to think that you're going to be able to say in 3 years' time we're going to need this many cybersecurity people and this many engineers?
Look, you can look at general trends and we will need more cybersecurity people in 3 years than we need today. So that one I can say relatively confidently. But I think it's, if you then go into what are the skills that cybersecurity expert is going to need, then I don't think anyone really knows what those skills will be in 3 years' time. So I do think it's a bit of a fool's errand. But I think that comes back to the point that Attila opened on, which is what we really need to be building are capabilities into people rather than just skills. And I think that there we can look and we can see a number of the capabilities that are valued, and they are the big long-term trends that we discussed up front.
Yeah. So another question from the audience is about, early on in our discussion we talked about schools not apparently having produced the foundational skills that people need. So there's a piece about even before we get to vet or unis, and also students not necessarily knowing what kind of roles they could even parlay their education into. While we're all talking about increasing the partnership between unis and vet, is there more we need to do to increase the interface between unis, vet and schools? And if so, what does that look like?
I'm happy to start there. TAFE and all vet providers have quite a big play in schools already, and schools, as most people may or may not know, can already undertake some of the qualifications that sit out of the that sit from the AQF, that are vocational qualifications. We're already, to some extent, there. But I'm not sure that's the answer to your question entirely. I think your question is really around back to those transferable skills that equip people who exit school, regardless of which direction they go in. And although we're a great advocate for vocational learning being in schools, it needs to come with that very good package of foundation skills, because that, and having listened to some of you as well over the last couple of days, you're also experiencing students coming in now with perhaps not the levels of skills that you might have expected in the past. And of course, COVID also changed some of those capabilities in the way in which people learnt, in particular in some of our states. So I think schools have a mission, and the mission has to be to equip people who exit school to have the transferable skills that they may need for a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of being able to contribute to both their society, to their families, and to the economy. So a bit of both.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, Attila?
I think there are two challenges. This one is what skills in general schools are putting out, and I do think universities got more connection now to schools than ever before. If you think through even the participation rate in universities, over the last 15 years, it's gone up from whatever it is, 20% to 42%. So now more and more parents are connected to universities who have school children and so forth. So there's a bigger connection going there. The one that I'm much more worried about is actually the heterogeneity of those skills. Okay, in some schools you've got all the wonderful maths, STEM skills. They know exactly what a university is or a TAFE is. They know exactly where they want to go. In other areas you don't. And let's not rely on the poor old career counsellor. You know, the world is so changed. You know, relying on them just to be the single point to provide career advice is again perhaps another fool's errand, or putting them under undue and unfair pressure. What role the universities do have is how can we help fix some of that heterogeneity? So earlier this year, UNSW announced that we were moving towards a 25% of our student body being from low SES, regional, remote or Indigenous students. And that's a 5-year plan to make sure that we could really build up. Now, a simple way of tackling that would be to provide more living scholarships at university, okay? Because one of the big barriers is living for people coming from disadvantaged or other backgrounds. But that's not the right answer. That's part of an answer, don't get me wrong. But the right answer is to how do we reach into the schools back in year 9, into year 10, to raise aspiration? How do we provide augmentation programs for the schools where they don't have the high skills learning that we need? How do we support them all the way through 11 and 12? How do we provide mentors? How do we, once they get into university and the engineering faculties come up with brilliant programs for those students who don't have the necessary math skills, how do we augment them so they can be successful at university? Because for me, if we think through part of the one of making sure the university is accessible to everybody, it's not about getting people from all segments of society into university. It's about making sure they succeed at university at just as much. And I know you started off with your university being the most employable. I got this AFR award lately that said we're the most employable. I'm sure there's some of the data, but I want to make sure
you and I can talk about that outside.
Every single student at both of our universities, okay, regardless of what educational journey they've been on before they get to university, is just as successful when they leave university.
Yeah, and we've certainly been making that transition, not just from going to primary schools to give less advantaged students the aspiration to come to university, but doing concrete work with them to help them succeed in their HSC, you know, putting on First Nations HSC support days and so on, so that we get them through in a state that they're ready to come to university. So you're right that we have to think about that as a complete continuum of both aspiration and support all the way through. not something that universities are remotely funded or set up for. So it is the kind of thing that we probably should be putting to the accord, to be thinking about that educational process as not one that starts at the point where a person enrolls at university, but in fact many years before that. Here's a challenging one for you, Tim. Someone said, for 30 years businesses have complained that unis weren't teaching students the right stuff, and yet those people are probably all employed in businesses now, and they're the ones that are complaining. What can we do to get better happiness about the universities producing the skills that industry needs?
Yeah, look, again, I probably have a different view, and I think, look, so I spent 10 years in the US, and the most interesting thing to me it was the way in which we will talk down our accomplishments and Americans will over-talk theirs. And it's just a cultural difference, right? There's just no way you'd have an American sitting there talking about how poor their universities are and on a global scale that they don't compete and etc. And I genuinely think that that same person in Australia would just describe things in a very different way. Look, we hired at MYOB phenomenal graduates out of Australian universities. You know, I will say, if we took an undergraduate with a computer science degree, it generally took sort of about 9 months for us to get them to be productive in our workplace. So it's not as though they're stepping out on day one to be work ready. But I don't think that that's a realistic expectation, because the workplace is moving and changing so quickly that if the syllabus was set up 4 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked anyway. And getting back to, again, the point that sort of we've made multiple times here, we didn't screen for the specific skills that they were going to need to go in and take that job on day one. You know, what we were looking for was a well-rounded person who had the capacity and the capability to build a long-term career within our business. And so, yeah, it's a hard one for me to answer because I don't really agree with the supposition.
The point that you raised, though, about the need for students to actually learn the on-the-job skills as well. I mean, presumably both Attila's and Jenny's sectors would both hope that we're doing better with work-integrated learning to make sure that more and more students do come out not with skills that were designed 4 years ago, but with skills that are current. And Jenny's already talked about some of the challenges of making sure students have a good experience of work-integrated learning. Jenny or Attila, have you got any insights from your work on what the providers can do to actually incentivise employers to provide the right, and to assist them to provide the right kind of work-integrated learning so that they will come out more job ready?
First off, I thought it was very refreshing, Tim's response, which said, we don't expect them to be able to do everything in a job on day one. We have a responsibility as the employer to have that person with the generic skills that we know has also got the technical skills, but may not have those job task-focused skills. And I think that is the responsibility of employers, to recognise and to support where a student might have this set of skills, but hasn't quite got those, that they have to train them. And employers have always done that. I mean, all of us have gone into jobs, I'm sure, over our lifetime where we don't know it all and we can't do it from day one. But I do think the move from the university sector and from the higher levels of our sector in TAFE, the higher level qualifications, to do more in the workplace and to do it that in a way that gets the student much more equipped for understanding what they are going to go into and what the expectations are, is working really well. And again, getting those employers to be able to be good mentors in that process is so fundamental. And that's what employers expect. They do expect the workplace experience, but sometimes they're not always well equipped to be the mentors, and that's where I think our educators in our TAFE sector can actually really help with some of that.
Any insights in, and I think you said, Attila, that you aim to have the vast majority of your students getting some experience of work-integrated learning. Any insights on when that works well, and if it doesn't, what the university can do to make sure that it's a good experience for the student?
And there are multiple ways. And if you look at the evidence collected over many years for internships while you're at university, the strong evidence is people who've had internships are more likely to get their first job, and more likely to succeed at it, okay? And so, I mean, that then behooves us all to think through how can we make sure that all of our undergraduate, postgraduate, or particularly undergraduate experiences have, if not internships, but internships, work integrated learning, but in a very broad sense. So one of the things we can't think of necessarily that an internship may be, 6 months working at an accounting firm, which may be, okay, but it could also be starting your own business. One of the things we have at UNSW is we spend a lot of time, I think we had some 13,000 student interactions with what we call our Founders Program last year in doing their startups or thinking through startups. Now, those are very different work experiences, but again, set students up for the business. And now, why might not always make sure that, the business has somebody who can literally on day one do that? Because as Jenny said, every employer is different. What we can do through work integrated learning, bringing businesses, solving real problems. I mean, another program that I know your university does, as does ours, we make sure the problems that the students solve are real world industry ones. We bring industry in and we give them problems. I remember a few years ago, we had at one stage at our university, the CEO of Visa came in to give a really gnarly problem to first-year students. Now, they came up with a brilliant answer. He said, look, I could have paid millions of dollars for a consultant for a much better answer than you gave, okay? But it's different to say the old Harvard case study where there was, here's a problem, here's the answer. What we're doing in I suppose, the modern classrooms now is giving students problems that have necessarily no answer, but the business wants solved now. So I think there are many mechanisms that we can do, and we are driving hard. The challenge, of course, as you know, Renee, is that as we do this, our funding model is coming under pressure as we make sure that we have people from all aspects of society coming into university, that we support them, that we provide work integrated learning, that we provide industry problems, that we provide internships. All these things are critical to the student experience, but it is putting a strain on the university.
Funding isn't everything, but it's not nothing either. Look, we've had a really broad-ranging discussion all the way from the specifics of internship and work-integrated learning up to how we create the creative, problem-solving, human-oriented people of the multiple future careers. Can you join with me in thanking Jenny, Attila and Tim for bringing us a really stimulating discussion?
Thank you, Jen.
The internationalization of higher education through mobility of students has grown considerably over the past few years. They add to the skilled workforce and create meaningful connections. But also, there have been instances of documentary frauds at the time of admission. To eliminate that, a thorough background check is required by the institutions. This is where the need of a trusted credential evaluation partner, CredEvaluate Global, arises, who follows due diligence, ensuring the onboarding of only genuine candidates to top institutions. Specializing in assessing frauds, CredEvaluate Global conducts due diligence using AI-powered software platform, CredEvaluate Assessment Central, to assess the credentials of the applicants. We consistently achieve operational excellence in faster turnaround time with high quality, integrity, ethics, and transparency. We endeavor to become the trusted and preferred compliance partner to the global institutions.